here in the room a 2L here at the University of Colorado School of Law, Stacey Weber a 3L at the University of Colorado School of Law, and virtually we have Will Shand, a PhD student at the University of Virginia. Hi, Will. I will let you all take it away. Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Stacey Weber. Bryan and I are going to do our best to stay 6 feet apart up here. We're just delighted to be here today. Just want to start with a big thank you to Amy, to Silicon Flatiron Center for the opportunity both to work on this project and to get to share some of our work with you today. So we'll start with some introductions. Again, my name is Stacey Weber. I'm a 3L here at the law school. I was on the first research team of the Encryption Compendium in January of 2020. So that initial phase, getting up and going, getting resources, and contributing to the research portion.
Hi everyone, I'm Bryan Hindin. I'm a 2L here at Colorado Law. I was on the second iteration of the Encryption Compendium research team. My team focused primarily on taking all of the work that Stacey and Will did and getting it into the format you can now see online today.
And hello everyone, I hope I'm coming through okay. Sorry I couldn't be there today, but I'm Will Shand. As Amy mentioned, I'm a PhD student at the University of Virginia. And I was also part of the first team working on the Encryption Compendium, mostly focused on designing the website and making it into like a publicly accessible resource that you can all see today.
So you may be asking yourself, what is the Encryption Compendium? I think the best place to start is with our mission statement, a little bit of an overview of what we did. The Encryption Compendium at concept is meant to be your one-stop shop, central hub for policymakers, legal practitioners, anyone in the general public who's interested in learning about the encryption debate. As Professor Blaze indicated in his fantastic presentation earlier, it's quite a broad subject, a lot of differing opinions and subject matters that really need to be fleshed out in full force. And we wanted to create a one-stop resource and database for that. Now, as was also indicated by Professor Blaze, a lot of the debates surrounding encryption have been somewhat cyclical in nature, and there are recurrent themes. And the encryption debate is largely characterized as kind of two competing interests. We have user privacy set against different iterations of the conversation around national security. On one end, encryption provides really valuable resources and important user privacy and security on the internet and in the way that we conduct our daily lives. And on the other end, those same protections, at least from the standpoint of national security interests, are conceptualized as an impediment. They impede law enforcement investigations and in different facets, investigations and the prevention of cybercrime and intelligence gathering.
So in building the compendium, we really wanted to be able to capture these various threads and reflect the conversations that were going on, but also do so in a way that allowed everyone involved to trace the way those ideas have evolved, have resurfaced, have recirculated with each turn of the wheel. And we were hoping that that would allow understanding of the conversations to help us better navigate them moving forward. So for example, as we have up here, depending on how you might count, we've been through at least 3 cycles and sets of terminology around the need for government access, what that should be called, what it should look like. And we wanted to make sure those themes and those consistencies were reflected in the compendium. Which really brings us back to the mission that we were working on and kind of the way it unpacked into 3 major goals. So we wanted the Encryption Compendium to have a comprehensive aspect. We wanted to capture resources from 1970 to present. Not every single thing that's ever been written about encryption in the last 50 years and drown users in mountains and mountains of resources, but still quality over quantity, pulling together the major resources, the big conversations, the turning points, the major themes that reflect the breadth of the debate in a usable and accessible way for users. And that means it also had to reflect all facets of the conversation. If it would be useful to anyone, much less everyone, as we're hoping, it needed to be holistic, it needed to be balanced and complete. So we aim to work to give all of the powerful arguments that were contributed from all sides. And then finally, we prioritized tracing the historical development and the substantive policy positions, making sure we had the big pieces, and then layering the themes on. We've been saying quite a bit to really pull out, here's what happened at each stage, and here's how it connects, here's how it traces through a larger picture and pattern.
And as an overarching long-term focus of ours, maybe somewhat optimistically, we're hoping that the collection of all of these resources in one place can at least contribute to ending the stagnation and cyclical nature of this conversation, with the idea being that if all of our resources are readily available in one place, we can readily identify how these conversations have transpired in the past, and also hopefully prevent repetition of the exact same conversation as we transition into new phases of the encryption conversation.
So the Encryption Compendium itself is a publicly accessible resource that you can see today. It's available on encryptioncompendium.org if you're looking for it. And when you visit the site, you'll be initially greeted with our kind of mission statements and this search bar that you can use to start accessing the compendium. We currently have about 200 or so compendium entries currently listed, which you can either look up by direct text search on the summaries that Bryan and Stacey have written, which they'll be going over a little bit more later on. Or you can look up based on tags on the entries themselves, which include categories like specific topics such as Clipper chip or time periods, countries that the compendium entries are based around, and so on and so forth.
So you may be asking yourself, what's actually in it? As Stacey mentioned, one of our overarching goals was to get a variety of resources and opinions, but we also wanted to ensure that the substantive pieces were varied in and of themselves. And so that in addition to getting a wide array of opinions, you got a wide array of type of material that would be valuable in understanding the encryption debate and exploring it to the fullest depth possible. So the first category of those materials is legislative materials, as by and large, this is where a lot of the substantive progress we would hope takes place. If we're going to reform certain aspects of encryption policy, that's going to take place in a legislative capacity. And so as an example, within the compendium, we have draft bills, like the 2016 draft of the Compliance with Court Orders Act, proposed by Senator Burr, which relates to the going dark debate and efforts to force private companies to comply with court orders to essentially provide decrypted material. Similarly, in keeping with our goal of capturing the entirety of the conversation, we wanted to make sure that those substantive conversations were captured, and that was largely in the text of hearing materials. So we also have hearing materials from, for example, Senator Chuck Grassley and the conversations in 2015 surrounding the going dark debate and exploration of the different policy interests that emerged within that debate. And we wanted to ensure that the compendium had those really valuable resources for you in one spot. The next category of materials that we have are what we characterize as reporting and advocacy materials. This means largely journalistic coverage of the encryption debate, as well as opinion pieces from legal practitioners. For example, here we have two examples of the encryption debate happening in real time. The two political articles that you see on the slide actually interact and respond with one another. It's a really great example of a conversation that takes place in the encryption debate happening in real time. The first is a piece from Cyrus Vance, which really stresses the national security interests related to decrypting smartphones. And it's just another iteration of the going dark debate that we have. And in contrast to that, we have a response, which stresses the importance of user privacy and why conversations surrounding criminal activity on smartphones are misplaced, or weighing privacy interests above concerns, specific concerns that are stressed in the article itself. And similarly, we also just wanted to make sure that news events were captured. So as you can see, we have pieces that cover large developments within the space of encryption from a non-legislative space. And finally, I think no database of encryption materials would be complete without the foundational scholarly and scientific works that form the real substance of these conversations. So for example, we have foundational pieces, such as Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman's New Directions in Cryptography, which provides scientific analysis on the efficacy of early encryption. We also have more exhaustive policy pieces, such as Cryptography's role in securing the information society by the National Research Council, which offers really extensive background on cryptography and its overarching policy implications. And finally, we have retrospective pieces that, similar to what we're trying to accomplish with the Encryption Compendium, look backwards and talk about the drawbacks of repetition in the encryption debate and why, much like our encryption compendium, highlighting the cyclical nature of this debate can be valuable in trying to stem some of the impeded progress that comes from repetition and what we would characterize as stagnant conversation.
So given this look at what the Encryption Compendium is, what it includes, our goals and our mission, we also wanted to take a little bit of time today to talk about how we created it, what went into making it, for all those academics out there, sharing our methodology, and also the lessons that we learned along the way. So first up, as students, we were new to the subject matter, which meant a lot of the way we organized and began our research had to accommodate the fact that we were on a huge and incredible learning curve. So we read a couple of introductory sources just to get our feet on the ground a little bit, and then tried to divide and conquer and cast as wide of a net as we could to pull in a lot of sources and get the research team up and running. It actually turned out that our research styles were quite varied, and that served our research very well. So we all had a different instinct of how we wanted to become immersed in this topic. One student said, okay, I'm gonna go by topic. I'm in charge of Clipper chip. And we said, okay, great, we'll stay out of your way. Someone else looked by time period. And what were the developments from the 70s to the 90s that led up to the Clipper chip debate? Let's make sure we have all of those. Another student went by type of source, saying, what's the government doing? Let's get all those legislative materials, those hearing testimonies, those committee reports that Bryan was telling us about, and make sure we have that action in our database. And then another student took a rabbit hole, tree root kind of approach, following the footnotes, starting with a couple major pieces, and then tracing all the sources that the experts cited to make sure we captured those. We also tried to automate wherever possible to assist our coordination, that as we were getting up to speed substantively, we wanted to reduce the administrative work, and we also needed to stay coordinated and organized as a team. So Zotero was our very good friend. It's a free and open source software, or FOSS, group resource and research management tracker, that it has a website, a browser plugin, and a desktop app that you can capture sources. It will pull in all the bibliographic information for you. So we weren't manually entering author names, URLs, dates of publication, mostly, and lets us designate a source type to organize the information, stores a snapshot of the source, and even has a tag supporting function. So this was a really helpful way that the research team could coordinate, sync, store, stay organized, make sure we weren't repeating each other's work, and then also coordinate with the dev team to say, okay, here's everything we have, you go do your design and presentation magic. And that was a really helpful tool. Zotero and Google Drive were very good friends in those initial stages. We also then moved into trying to build out this as an iterative process. So we did look backs. For example, this chart was one look back, looking at our sources by topic and making sure we weren't missing anything. Are our topics built out? Are we missing one? Is one a little thin? We also looked by time period. Is there a gap in time that we need to go back and make sure our research is complete? Making sure, do we have all voices on an issue, not just what we found first or not something that personally resonates? We also, that iterative process and reflection helped us refine our research process. So two things that really stuck out were we needed double tags for timing. So we were tagging the decade that each source was published in, but for sources that looked back or gave a history, for example, there's some great pieces in the 2000s that reflect on the 1990s, they needed to be tagged as 1990s sources too, to make sure that we had that reflected, that those are helping us understand what was going on in that time period. And finally, we were looking at links. So some of the links broke, and the Wayback Machine became our very good friend, which meant we were focusing on making sure our sources were all recovered, but then also we had to find a way to make sure we protected our resources so that someone didn't follow after us and come across links that had broken after our research. And finally, we had some lessons learned. Some of those problems we saw coming and solved along the way, and other ones we had to go back and face later. One was, I've been told this in class, it turns out to be true, now is better than later to do work. Zotero is a magical source, but its formatting is inconsistent. Some titles are pulled in all caps, some are pulled in all lowercase, and that's a nightmare to go back and look at and fix later. Some sources the metadata isn't complete for the bibliographic information, and so going back and doing that cleanup work showed us that it's a good idea to do it as we go. That also led us to realize we needed to start and go back and find and store clean PDFs of every resource we encountered. Some of the sources were behind paywalls that we could access through our student accounts, so that was great for us, but not great for assembling a complete resource that's directly accessible, at least within the center, and then realizing that public accessibility is a distinct mountain that would need to be climbed in the future. We also needed those PDFs then to be clean and not have advertisements printed over them. So that entire process of making sure our data and our research was protected ended up having several facets to it. And finally, Zoteric's beautiful aiding function of suggesting tags for us turned out to be a terrible idea. We had a granularity problem. Every resource in the Encryption Compendium could be tagged Encryption, but that's not useful. Similarly, some of the tags were overly granular, that they were only indicating one or two sources, and that's not helping get a sense of the conversations either. So we ended up going back and doing a lot of tag refinement to make sure we were properly localizing each conversation, how it fit together, but in a way that's, again, user-friendly.
So the second research team that worked on the Encryption Compendium was primarily focused with taking all of the fantastic resource and some of the website build out that the first team had done and making sure that the material on the site was actually as valuable as possible to our users. We didn't want just a collection of resources. We wanted you to be able to find the resource you're looking for and then have a snapshot into what it actually said. We didn't want you to have to go through the exhaustive process of reading what in some circumstances is a 300-400 page book that may have been published as recently as 1970 and trying to draw conclusions from it as to whether or not it's even of value to you. So our team at the beginning of our semester identified what we thought were the 5 most important things we could provide for every resource on the site. That was the source name, meaning not just the title of the material, but who published it, what group or organization they belonged to, and their occupation. In addition, we wanted to make sure that we captured for you a thesis statement. Essentially, that boiled down to a 1 to 2 sentence summary of the overarching argument of the resource itself. Third, we wanted to make sure that any relevant factual background we could provide around the resource was there. So especially in circumstances like with bill drafts, you understood the context as to why it had arisen. And ultimately, that brought us to our fourth point, was any post-publication outcomes that we could provide. Was the bill enacted? Did it die in Congress? Or with scholarly pieces, for example, what impact, if anything, that we could assess did it have on the conversation? And then finally, if we could, capturing an overall purpose and a setting within the encryption debate. So as we go to the next slide, I'll show you an example of what the site looks like now. Now, for every resource that you access on the site, you will see a page that looks like this. That's title, tags like Stacey mentioned, author, publication date, and a URL, in addition to the summaries that our team built out. And so here, while I won't make you read the site in detail, the source is captured. It's Professor Alan Rosenstein of the University of Minnesota Law School. We have a purpose statement. There's a warning of the dangers of foregoing end-to-end encryption and the anticipated consequences of the powers granted to the Attorney General in the then circulating draft of the EARN Act. We have a thesis, which is essentially a summary of the main arguments Professor Rosenstein makes, and a little bit of factual background and post-publication outcome. So we have a little bit of a summary around Senator Lindsey Graham's proposition of the bill and its status.
Finally, the web development team also learned its share of lessons throughout designing the compendium. Over time, we kind of, and I'm sorry, joined by a friend here on camera who wants to talk about encryption as well. All right, but over time, we learned a few different lessons about kind of what the requirements were for a site like this and what we want to make sure we built into the site to guarantee that it would, be able to live on after us. So our first major goal with designing the site, right, was to work with tools that's, we like that work with tools that we were familiar with as developers, but also tools that the researchers themselves were familiar with. So in Stacey's team's case, they decided to choose Zotero, which was great for us because Zotero has a nice public API that we were able to access and use to collect all the entries from Zotero and publish them on the site. That was a major goal for us, making sure that we could actually work well with the researchers and accommodate their research style. Another major goal for us was making the site as easy to maintain and deploy as possible. So that was a lesson that we had to learn kind of the hard way. We came into the project with a lot of technologies that we were familiar with and that we really liked, like Django, Docker, Postgres, whatever. And about like 3/4 of the way through the project, we realized, wait, this is way too complicated. This is going to be horrible for anybody who comes after us, especially if they're not already familiar with these things, right? So we decided, hey, let's strip this down as much as possible. Let's make this the simplest, as simple as we possibly can. We managed to convert this incredibly complex technical stack that we developed into a fairly basic website, basically as simple as we were possibly able to make it, while keeping the majority of the functionality. So that we could both make the site, again, like as easy to maintain for future teams that were going to join the encryption compendium in the future, but also make it very easy to host the site in a number of different ways, regardless of what resources were available. The final goal that we were trying to achieve with the website was just making the compendium as easy to extend in the future as possible. So I'll be going to that a little bit more, but we have all these cool ideas that we still want to add to the compendium to make it like the most useful possible resource for anybody who's going to be doing research off of it. And so we hope that our design that we made would help facilitate that extension, that enhancement in the future.
And much like Will foreshadowed, just as the encryption debate is a living and breathing thing, ever evolving, we view the encryption compendium the same way. And we hope that our tenure on the encryption compendium won't be the end of its evolution. And as the debate evolves and moves forward, we hope that the compendium will continue to capture these resources and capture the debates that it is of value as we envisioned it. And to that end, and I know it'll get touched on in much more detail than I could ever possibly do later this afternoon, and I know Professor Blaze indicated it a little bit as well, there's a new frontier in the encryption debate. Not necessarily a new software, but definitely a new conversation surrounding client-side scanning. And it's becoming an increasingly important part of the debate, especially with companies like Apple, considering implementation of softwares like their CSAM synthetic match system to combat the dissemination of those materials online. So we've continued, even beyond our tenure a little bit, to try and capture those resources, and Will's going to go into significantly more detail about how we hope that the community at large can aid in capturing these resources moving forward. But we recognize that this is going to be a very pertinent part of the encryption debate moving forward. So much in keeping with the way that we've captured resources in the past, we have legal practitioner assessments of the status and implications of CSS in the present day. And we also have much deeper analyses of the actual efficacy of these systems and the implications as they relate to user privacy and evaluating the merits of the national security and, in the CSAM context, criminal law enforcement investigation capacities. And we know that finding a balance between the interests of privacy and law enforcement entities, as has been the case throughout all iterations of the encryption debate, is going to continue to be a key focus of research and policy discussions in this context. And so we hope moving forward, continuing to catalog this research will only aid and hopefully prevent cyclical conversations surrounding the new manifestations of the encryption debate.
And finally, there's still a lot of development going on the compendium. So, of course, as Bryan mentioned, the encryption policy, the encryption debate is continually evolving. It's changing all the time. So we're hoping to get to the point where we can start accepting public submissions of new compendium entries and be able to update the compendium in real time as these debates are happening. We're also looking to add some more tools to the compendium to help researchers. So for instance, a nice timeline to kind of show the relative occurrence of different important events in encryption policy history. Of course, for instance, the 3 crypto wars that Professor Blaze mentioned earlier, but also more recent events and smaller events like the recent Apple CSAM debacle and so on. So tools like that, tools like adding notes to compendium entries, being able to export compendium entries in mass and so on. And finally, we're also looking to include more resources on encryption policy outside of the US. So of course, there are many countries outside the United States where there are parallel encryption debates going on that are equally important to the ones going on here where we live. And those also have a massive impact on people living throughout the world. So we'd like to expand the compendium to include more international resources going into the future. So today there are kind of 2 main ways to help get involved in the encryption compendium. First is that we have a public GitHub. So if you or someone you know enjoys contributing to open source projects, the entire encryption compendium is currently open source, and we're accepting submissions of pull requests for new code and new features that you'd like to add to the compendium, but also bug reports and so on. And so we do really appreciate any feedback that people provide through our public GitHub. And then finally, of course, Silicon Flatirons is the organization that's been sponsoring and hosting the encryption compendium. So anything you can do to help support Silicon Flatirons would also help to support the encryption compendium quite a bit as well. So thank you all very much for your time. And yeah, we'll turn it over to questions if there are any.
Sit all the way over here.
Thank you, Will and Bryan and Stacey. If anybody does have questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, which I'm trying to monitor simultaneously. So if I'm a little slow, I apologize. We do have one in the Q&A now. First, somebody says it sounds like a great compendium. So thank you to Andrew Zach. Are there any areas of editorializing, any places where you contribute your own thoughts or opinions?
I'll go first on the research side. You can go summaries.
Absolutely.
That was one of the things that we really focused on, is that we want this to be neutral. We want this to be policy neutral, politically neutral. And we felt that it takes away from the value, quality, and credibility of the resource to put our own spin on it. So that was actually something that was very actively present in our minds as researchers, going back, making sure we weren't missing any voices in collecting the resources. And then I fought the great battle of the tags and left the summarizing to Bryan and his team.
And I think my answer is very similar. We provided an example of a summary that we prepared that we tried to make as objective as possible. And I think the potential for editorializing really exists in that thesis section of it. So I personally really emphasize making sure that in any summary I provided, I always used the exact verbiage. I often did direct attributions, pulled exact quotes so that I was not editorializing in any capacity. And I know that my team members who aren't here currently also did the same thing. So I would emphasize that we focused on neutrality and ensuring that the resource was not biased as much as we possibly could.
Although I'll say we're still humans, so if you catch something that's missing or call us on it so we can fix it, because the point of the resource is to be open.
From Professor Jim Curry, this might be a question for you, Will. Do you worry about hacking or cyber attacks, or, and then I have a ... Kind of scare ellipsis. I would say, scare quotes. This is like a scare ellipsis.
Well, Professor Curry, I worry about them personally, especially with how ominously you posed that question. But as for the compendium itself, that isn't a major focus of the compendium at the moment, although it does tangentially cover a lot of things that we're interested in. There are certainly many things like backdoors into encryption mechanisms, right, which overlap greatly with what you're talking about. So while it's not, the primary concern of the compendium, it is definitely something that we have on our radar and try to incorporate wherever possible.
Any other questions in the room? I would be remiss without asking. I don't see anything else online. I want to offer a huge round of applause to all three of the teams. Really wonderful job. And we're deeply grateful for everything that you've put into this. And thank you, just from the bottom of my heart. We're going to take a short break now from this presentation.